Daniel neglected to disable the background audio during his live stream for his friends. A playful female voice emerged from the video. "You messed up my lingerie again. Can you stay with me just one more day? I don't want you returning to that old lady." A friend gently reminded him, "Aren't you worried Laura will hear this and cause a scene?" Daniel chuckled. "Does she have any other tricks besides these? In the past, I would have cried, made a fuss, and even threatened to hang myself. But this time, I simply liked the post without reacting." Daniel called me. "My flight's delayed. Don't wait for me to have dinner." His voice was calm and detached over the phone, his explanation feeling somewhat cold. If this had happened before, hearing those words would have made me say, "It's okay, I'll wait for you to get home." And I would have filled his waiting time with idle conversation. But now, I only responded faintly, not even saying, "Be careful on the road." The night before, I had been scrolling through Daniel's Instagram. It was unusual for someone like him, who never posted anything about marriage, to update his IG. Curious, I clicked on it, intending to like his new post after reading. But then, I heard the voice in the video. Daniel had forgotten to mute the background audio during his live stream. A sweet female voice was clearly audible. "Are you reporting to that old lady again? Ugh, you ruined my lingerie again. Can you stay with me just one more day? I don't want you returning to that old lady." At first, I thought it was a couple sharing sweet moments, until I scrolled to the last image. Daniel's low, indulgent laugh echoed. "I'll buy you new ones." Since I met Daniel, he had always been like a cold, aloof flower, elegant, reserved, and introverted. I had always believed someone like him could never openly express such ambiguous sentiments. After all, I had shared various sweet things with him in the past. Each time he would frown and interrupt, saying, "Laura, could you be a bit more restrained?" Daniel seemed taken aback by my brief responses. He probably wanted to say more, but I had already ended the call. What he couldn't say aloud, he could only message me. "I'll bring you a gift when I return. What do you want?" This was his way of making amends, or perhaps testing me. After Daniel posted that Instagram last night, one of his friends noticed the background audio's content. They commented on the post, "Aren't you afraid Laura will hear this and cause a scene?" Daniel quickly replied, "Does she have any other methods besides these?" Even through the screen, I sensed the disdain in his tone. He probably forgot that I was aware of his IG account. I could see their comments. Indeed, if it had been before, I would have definitely cried, made a scene, and even threatened to hang myself because I truly liked Daniel. I even had a pathological possessiveness over him. In the past, whenever a young woman appeared around him, I would be on high alert. Daniel hated it. We tortured each other this way, but remained together coldly for 3 years. When we got married, I even thought, no matter what, I would be with him for the rest of my life. But after only 3 years, I suddenly felt exhausted. I calmly liked Daniel's post and then turned off my phone to sleep. When I woke up, Daniel's IG post had already been deleted. Then I received a phone call saying his flight was delayed. I checked the flight schedule. The weather in his city was fine, and there were no delays. The only plausible excuse was the girl in the background audio. Daniel arrived home at midnight. When he saw me lying on the couch, his usually expressionless face showed a flash of surprise. "Didn't you say you wouldn't wait for me?" I hadn't been waiting. I had just fallen asleep while reminiscing about our little moments together. Daniel handed me a gift bag. "I brought you a gift." I was slightly surprised, thinking he was casually mentioning it before. Daniel asked me to open it. Inside was a small, cute figurine. It didn't seem like the type of gift he would choose. Suddenly, that sweet, playful voice echoed in my mind. Daniel stared at me, seemingly expecting a reaction, but I simply placed the gift back into the box. "Thank you." When he didn't see the expected reaction on my face, Daniel frowned and looked at me. "Don't you have anything to say to me? You should keep the noise down when you wash up. I need to rest. Don't disturb me." Daniel's frown deepened. Reflecting back, what did he expect me to say? Did he want me to ask about the live stream or inquire about the girl he brought back from his business trip? But none of that mattered anymore. Not even Daniel mattered anymore. The next day, Daniel went to work. At noon, I suddenly received his call. "Laura, didn't you bring me lunch?" Oh, right. Since marrying Daniel, I had always prepared lunch for him daily. Though Daniel didn't like me much, he appreciated the meals I made. These past few days, I had been busy and hadn't had time, so I suggested ordering takeout. There was a sudden silence on the other end of the phone. A couple of days passed like this. Then his family called. There was a family gathering the next day, and they wanted both of us to return to the old house. I texted Daniel, but he didn't reply. So I went to his office, but Daniel was still in a meeting. It's fine, I'll wait for him in his office. Daniel's secretary looked at me as I walked toward his office. He reached out to stop me. Uh, is there something else? As I spoke, I had already pushed open the office door. A gray and white cat suddenly darted out from the office. Uh, I couldn't help but scream. Seeing it was a British Shorthair, I froze. The secretary quickly picked up the cat and apologized. Sorry, ma'am, I forgot to tell you. Mr. Daniel has a cat. How could it be Daniel's cat? He has obsessive-compulsive disorder. When I wanted a dog at home, he refused. How could he be willing to keep a cat at the office now? And even let it into the office? The British Shorthair wore a peach-shaped love collar. No matter how you looked at it, the cat's owner must be a woman. I didn't know if it was to confirm my suspicions, but the next second, I heard the same playful female voice. Today I brought shrimp, corn, and curry chicken. You should try it later. Okay, honey, how did you get out? Their conversation exploded in my ears like thunder. I turned around and saw a man and a woman walking toward me. A chill ran down my spine. The man was Daniel. As for the woman, I knew her voice instantly. It was identical to the one from the background audio in Daniel's IG post a few days ago. They were chatting and laughing. Due to their height difference, Daniel slightly lowered his head to listen. His eyes and smile were filled with tenderness. When the woman saw the British Shorthair in the secretary's arms, her eyes lit up as she quickly stepped forward and took the cat into her arms. Daniel's gaze followed her, his expression soft and indulgent, until he slightly raised his eyes, his gaze cutting through the secretary and the woman. He saw me standing at the office door. In that moment, his smile vanished completely. The woman was completely unaware. She was playing with the cat in her arms while glancing over at Daniel. Daniel, look. She noticed the sudden change in Daniel's expression. It was as if, with some unspoken understanding, she turned to look at me simultaneously. This time, I finally saw the woman's face clearly. Just as I had imagined, young, playful, beautiful. Her eyes sparkled with a bright, shimmering light. The moment I saw her brows and eyes, I seemed to understand why Daniel felt differently about her. She truly resembled Daniel's lost love. Daniel had a girlfriend during his college years. She was well-educated, graceful, and gentle. They were the golden couple of the finance department, a story often talked about. Their breakup left many feeling deeply regretful. Later, on the day before Daniel and I were supposed to get married, she came to the wedding, but tragically died in a car accident on the way there. The sorrow in our marriage partly stemmed from that. All these years, I thought Daniel had long forgotten her. But I never expected. The girl, still holding the cat, blinked in confusion before deeply scrutinizing me. Jane, who is this? She called the secretary by name. The secretary looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. She glanced at the woman, then at Daniel, and explained, "This is Mrs. Daniel." "Mrs.?" the woman repeated, a faint smile on her lips. Her young face held an air of pride, as if she were used to being adored. Clearly, she already knew who I was. The earlier question had been intentional. Finally, Daniel snapped out of it and walked over to me. "You came?" His expression was flustered, and he unconsciously stood in front of me, blocking my view of her. He sure was protective. "I need to talk to you." Daniel motioned for me to follow him to his office. It wasn't necessary. I just had one simple thing to say, but he seemed worried that I might cause a scene with his little lover in front of everyone. He opened the office door for me before I could even speak. In the corner by Daniel's desk was a makeshift cat bed. Some cat toys were scattered across the desk. I could almost picture Daniel and that woman playing with the cat together in the office. Noticing my gaze, Daniel explained, "The cat belongs to one of the employees. I'm just watching it for them." How amusing. Who would dare ask him, the boss, to watch over an employee's cat? I didn't call him out on it. Daniel, eager to change the subject, asked what I needed. Just as I was about to speak, the office door was knocked on. "Daniel, honey's sick. What should we do?" Grace rushed in, her voice trembling with panic. Daniel's attention was immediately drawn to her. What happened? I don't know. It just happened all of a sudden. Daniel took the cat from Grace's arms. I watched as he gently comforted the British Shorthair in his arms. Some cat fur stuck to his sleeve and collar, but he didn't seem to notice. Take it to the vet first, Daniel decided swiftly, as though the cat were his beloved child. I suddenly remembered a time when I had a fever and felt miserable, asking him to drive me to the hospital. He had refused impatiently, saying, "Take a taxi, I'm busy." It turned out I couldn't even compare to that woman, let alone a cat. I sat there for no more than 3 minutes before Daniel was ready to leave. This time, I couldn't hold back and called out to him. "Daniel?" That's when he seemed to realize I was still there in the office. He was about to speak, but Grace looked at me with teary eyes. "Miss Laura, I know you need to talk to Mr. Daniel, but Honey's really sick. If we don't get a doctor, it could die. I wasn't stopping you from seeing a doctor. And couldn't one person go alone? You've never had a pet. You don't understand. Honey's like my child. I beg you. Let us take Honey to the vet first." Without saying a word, Grace had already begun accusing me. Daniel, unsure if he was more concerned for her or the cat, looked at me with a gaze full of reproach and frustration as though I was being unreasonable and delaying their trip to the doctor. "Laura, whatever it is, we'll talk when I get back." "No need, I just have one thing to say." I stood up and looked at Daniel, who was frowning. "Grandma's having a family dinner tomorrow. She wants us to come home for dinner. That's all." They could leave now. What was surprising was that Daniel actually froze. He looked at me with a strange expression. "That's it? What else?" I reminded him kindly. "You should hurry up. Don't waste time saving the cat." Daniel seemed taken aback, looking at me as if he wanted to say something but hesitated. In the end, it was Grace who pushed him to leave. That night, Daniel didn't come home. At midnight, I received a friend request on my phone with an anime cat avatar. I immediately knew who it was. After accepting, the person sent a picture of Daniel petting the cat. "Sorry, the cat's really clingy." She was young, and even her teasing had a touch of pride. I didn't respond, instead reminding Grace not to forget to mention the family dinner to Daniel. There was no reply. I had thought I would only see Daniel at the old house the next day, but to my surprise, I saw his car before I left. "I came to pick you up." When there's a free ride, why not take advantage of it? The passenger seat was spacious and clean. It seemed Daniel had washed the car before picking me up. I leaned back, closing my eyes to rest. From time to time, I felt his gaze on me. In the past, whenever I sat in his car, I would chat nonstop. Now, with my silence, the air in the car felt so still. Daniel gripped the steering wheel, and his voice broke the silence. "Laura, Honey was really sick last night. I stayed at the hospital, which is why I didn't come home." Strange, he had never explained himself before. If I asked too much, he would get annoyed. But now, I didn't ask, and yet he was explaining. "Laura, I know someone already told me." "Who told you?" His voice sounded tense. "The cat's owner," I answered truthfully. Daniel glanced at me carefully. "You mean Grace?" "She's my new secretary, and the cat was found downstairs in her building. She couldn't take it home, so—" "Laura, I know," I interrupted, not wanting to hear his explanation and cutting him off. When he met my somewhat impatient and indifferent gaze, Daniel was momentarily stunned. "Laura, why aren't you angry anymore?" After we got out of the car, Daniel reached out to hold my hand. I instinctively tried to pull away, but he held on tightly. Hearing his voice, I finally saw the elderly woman waiting at the intricately designed iron gate. That was Daniel's grandmother. If it weren't for her, I wouldn't have married Daniel. I was good at making her laugh, and she always said she wanted me to marry her grandson so she could be happy every day. At the time, Daniel and I were at a standstill in our relationship because of his lost love. It was his grandmother's kindness and care that helped us get through it. She was the best person in the Payne family, the one who treated me the best. Now, she was suffering from Alzheimer's. I didn't want her to sense any tension between Daniel and me and worry about it, so I endured his touch and forced a smile. "Grandma." She looked at us holding hands and smiled warmly. Daniel, seeing that I didn't reject you, also smiled slightly. Apart from his grandmother, Daniel had a mother. but my relationship with her was average. At the dinner table, she briefly mentioned Grandma's health, then changed the topic to Daniel and me. You two have been married for so long, when are you having kids? Daniel and I sat on the same side. When I heard this question, I caught a glimpse of his slightly stunned expression. This was an issue that inevitably came up at every family gathering. But in the past, Daniel would always choose to skip over it or brush it off. But this time, he carefully picked the bones out of the fish and responded with a short answer. I'm already preparing it. His mother and grandmother were both a little surprised and pleased by this, but I couldn't help but frown and glance at him. Daniel didn't respond to my gaze, but instead placed the boneless fish in my bowl. What's going on with him? I pushed the fish aside and coldly spoke up. Look again. I don't want to get angry right now. The table fell silent at my words. What do you mean by that? Saying things like this in front of the elders? Oh. After we got home, Daniel grabbed my hand, his tone filled with restrained coldness. I could feel his anger, so I countered, Did I say something wrong? Wasn't that how he answered before? Maybe it was the cold sarcasm in my eyes that made him pause. Daniel tightened his grip, his gaze locking onto me as though trying to read my mind. Laura, you said that on purpose, didn't you? You're angry. His voice softened a bit, tinged with helplessness. Is it because of that photo? If it is, I can explain. Hearing him bring it up again, I decided to meet his gaze directly. What's there to explain? Daniel was at a loss for words. Was he going to say it was just a dare or a prank? Who would believe that? I decided to remind him. You don't need to explain to me, but Grandma is in poor health. Make sure you keep your little secrets well hidden. Daniel hadn't lacked other women by his side before, but the relationships were too short-lived. There was no evidence to pursue, except this time, he posted it on Instagram. Even though he deleted it quickly, there was no guarantee it wouldn't get back to the elders. When he heard what I said, Daniel's eyes flashed with surprise. He studied my face intently. Suddenly, as if realizing something, he let out a cold laugh. Your tactics have improved, Laura. This time, I was the one who was puzzled. Just then, Daniel's assistant called. Daniel. The air between us was tense and silent, making Grace's sweet, soft tone seem all the more obvious. I didn't catch everything she said, but I heard half a sentence. Can you come keep me company? The emotions in Daniel's eyes were obscure. For a moment, they seemed to pass over me. I'm on my way. He responded, and the woman on the other end of the phone immediately sounded cheerful. Daniel gave me a deep look, then turned and left. That night, Daniel didn't come home. He didn't lack places to stay, and I no longer worried like I used to. The irony was, I didn't go looking for Daniel, but his assistant, Grace, came looking for me. Miss Laura, I came to get some clothes for Mr. Daniel. The next day, Grace was standing at my door. When she saw me, a deliberately pleasant smile spread across her face. Is he on a business trip? I asked. If Daniel were on a business trip, his secretary would have notified me in advance and come to collect his luggage. Someone like Grace showing up uninvited was a first. She entered our master bedroom with ease. She was picking and organizing Daniel's clothes. When she heard my question, Grace turned to look at me. Her beautiful eyes gleamed with clear provocation. He's not on a business trip. If he wasn't on a business trip, that meant he was staying somewhere else. I almost immediately understood. Grace smirked triumphantly. Miss Laura, if you find anything left behind, you'll have to bring it over. I smiled back. I turned and went into Daniel's study, grabbing a photo frame, and placed it on top of the clothes she was sorting. Don't forget this. Grace immediately saw the photo of Daniel with someone else. The person in the photo wasn't me, nor was it her. Daniel treasures this. Be careful not to break it. Who is she? Grace's tone became cold. I smiled. Daniel's first love. Funny enough, you resemble her quite a bit. But compared to the others, you're still a bit lacking. Grace's expression froze, the smug look she had earlier faltering. She left in a huff, frustrated and angry. Afterwards, she probably realized her behavior was less than ideal. She sent me a message. I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to stir things up between me and Daniel, but I won't fall for it. I shrugged in indifference, but to Grace, it seemed like I was ignoring her and declaring war. So, she cracked. The result was that she posted several photos of herself with Daniel on Instagram over the next few days. The captions were overly poetic. So happy to be your harbor. I knew Grace was trying to provoke me. So, when she posted another photo with Daniel, I couldn't help but remind her, don't you realize that these photos you're sending me are evidence of you being Daniel's mistress? She went silent. A few minutes later, she deleted all the photos. I couldn't help but laugh. Everyone laughs at you, but you're the one who looks the most foolish. Grace fell quiet. I didn't expect to see her again for a while. But a few days later, I ran into her again. This time, it was completely by accident. A longtime professor friend, Professor Carter, invited me out for a meal. He also showed me around his school. While we were there, we happened to attend the arts festival, where Grace was standing at the entrance with a welcoming banner. When she saw me, her expression flickered with a mix of emotions. In the end, she had to bow her head and greet me. Good afternoon, please follow me. Do you know her? After she left, Carter asked me. I hadn't expected him to be so perceptive, so I laughed lightly. I've seen her around Daniel. I spoke vaguely, but Carter furrowed his brow. You and Daniel. I don't have many close friends, but they all know how much I care about Daniel. They've seen how I truly feel about him. And now I've faced it all calmly and peacefully. Carter looked at me with a growing sense of pity. It was supposed to be a joyful reunion with an old friend, but with the way he was looking at me, I ended up comforting him instead. It's fine. Don't let it ruin our mood. I meant it. A reunion with a friend? What could be more important than that? Carter was left uncertain whether to laugh or to offer admiration. You're still the same as before. Unfortunately, midway through, he had an urgent task and had to cancel our meal together. I'm really sorry. Once I'm done, I'll treat you to a meal to make it up to you. It's fine. The small incident with Grace was quickly pushed to the back of my mind, but Carter stayed busy for an entire week. When I got his call again, he said, Laura, can you come over now? His tone was serious and not at all like he was inviting me out for a meal. I drove to the location Carter had sent and entered the private room. When I opened the door, I froze. In the room, besides Carter, there was Daniel, Grace, and several others. Laura. Carter stood up and walked toward me. What's going on? He smiled and turned toward the others. Now that both parties are here, why don't we all talk about it? It's not good to only hear one side of the story, right? Daniel's expression was dark. Grace's gaze was evasive. The other people in the room looked awkward. Finally, after Carter's explanation, I understood the whole situation. Carter had attended a friend's birthday party. Unexpectedly, Daniel and Grace showed up halfway through. At first, Carter didn't think much of it, but then Daniel started making an issue out of it. He asked Carter why she rejected Grace's application for postgraduate research. Grace was a hardworking and outstanding young woman. She hoped Carter would reconsider and reverse her decision. She applied to be under my supervision, hoping that I would accept her as a student, Carter explained. Then Carter rejected her, and that's when Daniel started speaking. But even after Daniel spoke, Carter still refused. It wasn't a big deal. The problem was that when Carter clearly stated she wouldn't take Grace as a student, Grace suddenly stood up, looking hurt, and said, Professor Carter, is it because of Laura that you won't accept me as your student? At the last arts festival, I saw her with you. I don't know what she said to you, but you shouldn't just crush a student's dream like this. As soon as Grace mentioned my name, the room instantly went quiet. No one expected this issue to be related to me, and Daniel's gaze toward Carter turned cold, filled with contempt. Are you close with Laura? Somewhat, Carter answered honestly. Grace's eyes filled with tears, and she stood next to Daniel, looking like she'd been wronged. So, did Laura tell you to do this? Carter, due to Grace's one-sided story and Daniel's unfounded accusations against me, couldn't stand it anymore. So, he called me and asked me to confront them directly. After hearing the full story, I was just as speechless as Carter. At this point, Carter turned back to Grace. This young lady, the reason I'm not accepting you has nothing to do with Laura. Don't spread false accusations. Grace still wasn't convinced. Why? My grades are excellent and my GPA is perfect. What gives you the right to reject me? Carter's smile vanished, and his expression turned serious. Because under my guidance, I don't accept students with bad character. As soon as Carter finished speaking, Grace's face went deathly pale. The others in the room wished they could sink into the ground. The message was crystal clear. After the warning, Carter's face softened back into his usual calm and kind demeanor. "Let's go. I'll buy you dinner." I nodded, looking at Daniel and Grace. I was about to leave with Carter, but just as I was about to turn away, Grace's frantic voice echoed behind me. "You're accusing me of having bad character. What about you? Laura is a married woman, and you're still having an affair with her." The room froze in shock, and it was dead quiet. Carter frowned and turned back. Grace glared at him in anger. "Huh! I've hit a nerve, haven't I?" Grace screamed. The sound of glass shattering echoed loudly. She bent down to avoid it, staring at the shards of glass scattered on the floor. The rest of her words were lost in my icy stare. Grace shivered, fear in her eyes as she looked at me. I walked toward her. She recoiled, nervously inching closer to Daniel. Just as I was nearly a step away from her, Daniel furrowed his brows and blocked my path. "Laura, that's enough," he scolded me, his voice tinged with frustration. How laughable. Just moments ago, when Grace was slandering me, he said nothing. Now, when I'm just warning Grace, he immediately steps in. I looked at Daniel coldly. "I know you're still mad at me. We're even now." "Even?" I sneered. "Daniel, your thoughts are disgusting and your actions are immoral. Don't think I'm like you. It makes me sick." Daniel's face turned ashen. I pulled Grace toward me and slapped her twice across the face. One slap for trying to seduce my husband and one for slandering my friend. She covered her cheek, looking shocked and furious as she glared at me. I glanced at Daniel and told Grace, "The things you're fighting for aren't even things I care about. If you want them, take them. No thanks necessary." Finally, I gave a mocking smile. Daniel suddenly grabbed my wrist. His voice panicked. "Laura, what are you doing? Can't you understand? I don't want you anymore. I want a divorce." I said it firmly, word by word. After we left, Carter took me home. He looked at my dark, cold face and carefully spoke. "Laura, when people are angry, they sometimes say things in the heat of the moment. You mean when I said I wanted a divorce?" Carter didn't deny it. I smiled lightly. "I wasn't acting out of anger, and you don't need to feel guilty. This has nothing to do with you. Love is like a cup of water with cracks. It leaks a little every day, and eventually it will be empty." And Daniel never noticed or tried to fix it. So, little by little, my feelings for him disappeared. Carter didn't try to comfort me anymore. He simply said, "Good luck." When I got home, I sorted through the things I had packed. During the time Daniel wasn't around, I finally had the space to discard old things. Just then, I received a call from Daniel's mother. Her first question was, "What's going on with you and Daniel now?" Apparently, she had somehow learned that Daniel and I were having problems. "I knew something was off the last time you came back. Laura, you need to stop throwing tantrums. Who could tolerate you acting like this?" I didn't have a particularly good relationship with Daniel's mother. A big part of the reason was because Daniel didn't like me. But I had no choice. Daniel married me because his mother insisted. I could hear the sarcasm in her voice and the endless expectations she had for how I should treat her son. "Mississippi." I couldn't hold back, so I interrupted her. She paused, surprised. "Did you just call me Miss?" I didn't answer her question. Instead, I said, "If you can't stand me, then let your son divorce me." "What?" Daniel's mother was left confused on the other end of the line. Half an hour later, Daniel arrived home. At that moment, I had just placed the divorce papers on the coffee table. Daniel looked at me, pushing my suitcase, and a flash of panic crossed his face. He quickly stepped forward and blocked my way. "Laura, stop this nonsense," he warned me in a low voice, his handsome face showing subtle dissatisfaction. "I'm not being foolish. The divorce papers are already signed." I pointed to the papers. He looked at them, his face changing slightly. "You're serious about this? Is this because of Grace? If you don't like her, I'll get rid of her. I won't contact her again, I promise." He swore to me. To this day, he still didn't understand. The real problem between us wasn't Grace. I didn't want to argue with him anymore. I pushed his hand away, opened the door, and left. Remember to sign the papers. Daniel didn't sign, of course. The news that we were getting a divorce quickly spread. Daniel's friends came to try and convince me, but I ignored every one of them. Aside from that, Daniel was also doing everything he could to try and fix things. After leaving home that day, I went to find a friend. I took a quiet job in their studio as a temporary transition. Starting from the third day, the studio began receiving flowers and lunch boxes. No names were given, just messages saying they were for me. "Who sent these?" my friend asked, seeing my expression. Could it be Daniel? I didn't confirm or deny it. It wasn't hard for him to find out my address. My friend sneered. If I had known it would end up like this, I wouldn't have gotten involved in the first place. I had once thrown myself into the whirlwind of loving Daniel, but my friends, who saw it all from the outside, had realized much earlier that something wasn't right. I threw the flowers Daniel sent straight into the trash. As for the food, there were a few stray animals in the garden below the studio. Sticking to my principle of not wasting things while doing a good deed, I fed the food to the strays. To my surprise, I ran into Grace there. "Laura, are you happy now?" She glared at me as if I had done something unforgivable. From the resentment in her words, I gathered that she had been fired by Daniel. Not only that, Daniel had even had his office thoroughly cleaned. The toys for the cats were removed, and on his desk, there was a photo of him and me. And because Carter had rejected Grace's request for a recommendation, people began speculating that something had gone wrong. Before long, someone dug up the affair between Grace and Daniel. Now Grace had lost her job and was being shunned and isolated at school. Unable to accept this, she came to find me. "If it weren't for you, how would I have ended up like this?" Grace complained, drawing the attention of several onlookers. I found it laughable and even more mocking. "Everything you're facing now, you brought upon yourself? You're lying. It's all your fault. You've become Mrs. Payne now. What more do you want? Why did you have to ruin me?" Grace wouldn't listen. I couldn't be bothered to argue with her. I made a direct call to Daniel. "Come and take your mistress away." 20 minutes later, Daniel arrived. He rushed out of the car, ignoring Grace completely, and came straight to me. "Laura, take her away." It seemed Daniel had only just noticed Grace. He frowned. "I didn't ask her to come find you." I didn't want to listen to his explanation and turned to leave. Behind me, I could hear Daniel scolding Grace and her pleading cries. "Liars! You said you liked me," Grace accused. Daniel looked at her indifferently. "Even so, no one compares to her." Grace froze in place. Daniel warned Grace not to bother me again, and then had her taken away. Although Grace left, Daniel still stood downstairs, unwilling to leave. This scene was witnessed by a friend from the studio upstairs. He was very unhappy and threw a bucket of water down. "How unlucky." I had originally thought that after this, Daniel would give up and sign the divorce papers. But a few days later, I received a call from his grandmother. "You haven't visited me in so long. When will you come back?" I could avoid seeing Daniel and his mother, but I couldn't ignore his grandmother. I went back to the old house, and unexpectedly, Daniel was there too. He was pushing his grandmother's wheelchair, looking at me with a gentle expression and a smile. "You're here, Grandma." Grandma happily took my hand and started chatting away, saying all sorts of things. I listened patiently. Daniel sat beside us. "Laura, you don't have a boyfriend, right? Look, this is my grandson. Isn't he handsome?" Grandma suddenly said. Daniel and I both froze. We knew she was having another episode. "Do you like him? If you do, Grandma will introduce him to you." Daniel interrupted helplessly, smiling as he explained to her in the face of her confused gaze. "I'm already married to her. She's your granddaughter-in-law now." "Oh, really?" Grandma asked, looking at me. Daniel's gaze was also full of hope. In the end, I nodded. "Ha ha ha. Good granddaughter-in-law. Granddaughter-in-law." "Daniel, you have to treat her well, understand?" Grandma finished instructing Daniel and then turned to me. "If this boy bullies you, just tell Grandma. I'll smack him." She held my hand and entwined it with Daniel's. I wanted to pull away, but Daniel held my hand tightly. I had planned to find a suitable opportunity to tell Grandma about my situation with Daniel when she was lucid, but the elderly woman was confused all day, and went to bed early that evening. It seemed Daniel had sensed my thoughts and found me. I had already guessed what he wanted to talk about. Sure enough, Daniel asked if we could hold off on the divorce for now. The doctor said Grandma's health isn't good, and she can't be upset. Laura, can we delay the divorce for now? His eyes were full of pleading, and his expression even seemed somewhat humble. A heavy weight pressed on my chest, leaving me speechless. Daniel and I resumed a temporary reconciliation. Whenever Daniel had free time, he'd take me to the old house to accompany Grandma. Life seemed to be turning into what I had expected. One day, Daniel once again took me to his grandmother's house. But this time, he suddenly said to Grandma, "Grandma, next week we won't have dinner with you?" "Ah, why?" Daniel smiled. "Next week is our third wedding anniversary. I made a reservation." When he mentioned the date, I paused for a moment. Daniel wasn't someone who cared much about formalities. And because our wedding anniversary was special, Daniel had never liked to mention it. I remembered the first year after our wedding, when I eagerly prepared a surprise, only to be coldly interrupted by him. Now, he was the one bringing it up, and I couldn't help but frown. Just as I was about to speak, Daniel suddenly took my hand. When I looked at him in surprise, Grandma had already clapped her hands happily. "Good, good. You two go ahead. Don't worry about me." On the way back, I couldn't help but say to Daniel, "Daniel, don't forget, we're in the middle of a divorce. Yes, even with Grandma around, I still haven't given up on divorcing you. But I could agree to keep it a secret from her." Daniel gripped the steering wheel. "I know, but I want to have a proper meal with you. Just this once, please." His eyes were pleading, and his demeanor seemed almost submissive. I fell silent. When he saw my consent, Daniel's mood improved over the next few days. He started leaving early and returning late. Anyone with eyes could tell he was preparing for that day. But unfortunately, the anniversary never came to pass. A few days before, I ran into Grace again. Unlike the last time, when she had been disheveled and irrational, this time she lifted her chin arrogantly when she saw me. "Looking for Daniel? He's not here." "I'm not looking for him. I'm looking for you." "Looking for me?" "I'm pregnant." At that moment, it wasn't exactly like being struck by a thunderbolt, but I was still deeply shaken. I looked at Grace in disbelief. There was a gleam of pride and satisfaction in her eyes. I snapped back to reality. "Oh, congratulations." I turned to leave, but Grace stopped me. "Did you not hear me?" I said I'm pregnant. She grabbed my arm, but I shook her off. "What does your pregnancy have to do with me? The child is Daniel's." "Then go to him. I'm not the father." I couldn't help but snap at her, but suddenly Grace dropped to her knees in front of me. "He won't let me keep the child, so I had no choice but to come to you." "Come to me? What was I supposed to do?" I felt a mix of anger and absurdity. Grace said, "Laura, I know I've wronged you, but my child can't grow up without a father. I beg you, talk to Daniel. Please let me keep this child." She pleaded, clinging to my arm. Her pull made my mind spin. I didn't know where the anger came from, but it surged up, flooding my head. It was anger at Grace, but mostly at Daniel. Just then, Daniel came back. He rushed toward Grace as soon as he got out of the car, pulling her up from the ground. "What are you doing here?" he scolded. Ethel was in tears. "Daniel, please let me keep the child." Daniel looked at me in panic. "Laura." I finally managed to free myself from the chaos, but my mind was still tangled in it. I turned back to Daniel, coldly staring at him. "Deal with your own problems. Grandma's still sleeping. Don't wake her." Daniel coldly staring at him. "Deal with your own problems. Grandma's still sleeping. Don't wake her." Daniel's face turned pale. Grace was still begging, her sobs echoing in my ears. I felt like my head might explode. Daniel's gaze turned colder as he gripped Grace's arm tightly. "I already told you. I'll give you some money as compensation. Why do you have to come and involve my family? But this is your child. I won't acknowledge it." Her words were silenced by the coldness in his eyes. Daniel said, "Don't push me." Grace seemed as though her soul had been sucked out of her as she stared at Daniel, confused. At that moment, I actually felt sorry for her. Grace glared at Daniel and me with resentment. Just then, I heard Grandma's voice from behind. "What's going on? Why all the noise?" Daniel and I both turned around. Suddenly, a figure quickly moved between us. With a loud thud, Grace fell to her knees in front of Grandma. Grandma, I'm pregnant. The child is Daniel's. What do you mean, Daniel's? I already have a daughter-in-law. They're getting divorced. Daniel cheated. I'm his true love. As soon as Grace finished speaking, Grandma's body shook violently, and she looked up at me and Daniel. Hospital! When Daniel's mother arrived, she didn't speak before slapping him hard across the face. Bastard! How could I have given birth to such an ungrateful son? Daniel didn't say anything. His mother then looked at me, as if she had something to say but stopped herself. She only asked, "How is Grandma doing?" "She's still under observation." The air grew heavy with silence. Half an hour later, the doctor came out. "The patient is awake. Family members may visit, but please don't stay too long." All right, all right. Daniel and his mother rushed into the room. I followed them and immediately saw Grandma lying weakly on the bed. When she heard us, she opened her eyes, and after a brief glance at Daniel's mother and him, her gaze fixed on me. "Come here." She gestured for me to come closer. I didn't dare speak and hesitated before stepping forward. Seeing the cloudy yet kind light in her eyes, I finally mustered up the courage to take her hand. Grandma. At this moment, she was unusually awake, looking at me with a tender, affectionate gaze. "Why didn't you tell me you were suffering so much?" I shook my head, tears falling as I felt deeply guilty. "Maybe I should have told you the truth earlier, so you wouldn't have to bear this blow. It's not your fault. It's Daniel who's wronged you." At the mention of Daniel, her body trembled slightly. Daniel stepped forward and knelt by her bed. "I'm sorry, Grandma. It's all my fault." Grandma looked at him with a mix of disappointment and sorrow. We didn't dare disturb her any longer. We quickly left the room. Daniel's mother had a dark look on her face. "First, clean up your mess. Don't show up in front of Grandma for a while. Oh, I almost forgot about Grace." As the one directly responsible for Grandma's hospitalization, Daniel had lost all patience with her. After Daniel stormed off, his mother turned to look at me. She seemed like she wanted to say something but hesitated. Finally, she sighed and said to me, "You should go rest now." In the following days, although I didn't see Daniel and Grace, I still heard updates about them through mutual friends. After the old lady was hospitalized, Grace went into hiding. She was terrified that Daniel would take revenge on her, so she didn't dare show up. But eventually, Daniel found her. She was so shocked that she had a miscarriage. By the time Daniel found her, she was too scared to even go to the hospital. One of my friends relayed the news to me. I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. 3 days later, Grandma gradually regained consciousness and was getting better. I went to visit her, and there I ran into Daniel. We both silently agreed not to bring up the divorce again. But that day, Grandma suddenly asked, "Are you and Daniel getting a divorce?" Both Daniel and I froze. I didn't want to deceive her any longer, so I nodded. "Yes." Daniel, standing beside me, trembled slightly, and I could feel his vulnerability, as though he couldn't hide his pain. I had expected Grandma to offer some advice or try to mediate, but instead, she just sighed deeply. "All right, I respect your decision. I was the one who brought you two together. Now that you're parting ways, I won't say anything more." She took my hand in hers, her voice rough and hoarse. "Laura, you will always be the child I love." Tears welled up in my eyes, and my throat tightened. After Grandma fell asleep, Daniel and I left the hospital room. By now, there was no need for us to pretend anymore. "You can sign the divorce papers now," I said. Daniel suddenly looked up, his eyes red. "Laura, can we not get divorced?" He rested his head on my shoulder, his arms around me as though he were trying to merge our bodies, his voice hoarse and desperate. "I was wrong. I love you. Can we start over?" When I loved Daniel, I longed to hear him say these exact words in return. But now that he had said what I once wanted to hear, my heart felt nothing. When I liked him, he liked someone else, his white moonlight. When we got married, I thought he loved me too. But the ghost of his white moonlight always lingered between us, and the gap between us only grew. As time passed, he fell in love with her replacement. For 3 years, we had been cordial but distant, living together in name only. And eventually, It all ended in a sad conclusion. I remained silent. Daniel knew by then that I was resolute. Warm tears fell on my neck. Daniel finally signed the divorce papers. He transferred 80% of his assets to me. "It's my fault. No amount of compensation can make up for it," he said. Soon Grandma found out about our divorce. She closed her eyes with a deep sigh of regret. The day I signed the divorce papers happened to be our third wedding anniversary. The restaurant called to check with Daniel. "Sir, do you still need anything else for the private room you reserved?" "No, it's fine. Just cancel everything." "Ah." Daniel lowered his head and spoke softly. "My wife and I are getting divorced. We won't need it anymore." There was a moment of silence on the other end, followed by an awkward click as the call ended. Later, Daniel asked me, "Laura, do you think we could still be friends?" I frowned. "Let's not. It's probably best if we never see each other again." After that, we never saw each other again, just as I had hoped. The only time we crossed paths again was 6 months later, at Grandma's funeral. I packed up the divorce papers and left, only to receive a call from Carter along the way. "Got time? Want to grab a bite?" "Sure, I'll come pick you up." From the shadows into the sunlight, a gentle breeze, a clear sky. Everything was a fresh start.